The frost lay heavy over the steppe that morning, clinging to the steel carcasses of tanks like a final accusation. In the grey light, the Soviet depot near Kursk looked less like a place of war and more like a graveyard for machines. T-34s torn open, their engines bleeding oil onto the frozen earth, Panzer wrecks twisted into grotesque sculptures of defeat and defiance. Among the smoke, steam, and silence, men moved like shadows, half ghosts, half labourers of survival. They worked without chatter, without hope for warmth, each one repeating motions that had become ritual. Somewhere within that ruin, one man was rewriting the future of the Eastern Front, though no one yet knew it. His name was Mikhail Misha Elbow Voronin, a tank mechanic of no rank, no recognition, and no patience for failure. He was 32 years old, but looked closer to 50, with eyes that had seen too much metal burned, too many comrades buried under treads and shrapnel. His nickname came not from affection, but from awe. He could tighten a bolt or loosen a seized valve with the sheer leverage of his arm, jamming his elbow into the machinery until it gave. The younger mechanics swore he could feel the pulse of an engine through his bones, that he spoke to the T-34s like a priest whispering over the dead. In truth, Misha was less a man of faith than of fury, furious at the cold, at the shortages, at the endless orders that sent men to die because a tank moved 1 kilometer too slowly. That winter, Soviet armor faced a crisis invisible to most generals. The T-34s, once the pride of the Red Army, were faltering. In the vast expanse of the Russian front, mud and frost turned engines sluggish, fuel lines froze, and transmissions cracked under strain. Against the Germans' refined Panzers, with their precision-built systems and superior optics, the T-34's brute reliability was supposed to be its advantage. But even brute strength has limits when the air itself seems to fight against it. Every morning, mechanics lit fires under the hulls, just to thaw the engines enough to start them. Some tanks never woke again. Supplies were thin, spare parts scarcer still, and every delay meant another village overrun, another trench lost. It was during one of those desperate mornings that Misha found his idea, not through inspiration, but through rage. He had spent 2 days trying to start a KV-1 that refused to turn over. In frustration, he smashed his elbow against the injector pump, cursing the engine's foreign laziness. Something shifted, a faint, sharp click, followed by an unexpected hum. The idle smoothed out, the smoke cleared, and the tank ran cooler than it ever had before. He stared at the machine, breathing hard, his arm throbbing, and realized he had stumbled onto something that shouldn't have worked. The diesel injectors, long misaligned by the cold and poor manufacturing tolerances, could be retimed by hand, by feel, if adjusted just slightly, enough to let the engine breathe differently, run cleaner, faster, and burn less. It was an accident born of anger, but it would become legend. Within a week, Misha had taught the other mechanics his elbow trick. No manuals, no instruments, just the angle of the arm, the turn of a bolt, and the patience to feel the vibration through bone. Word spread through the depots, carried by men who no longer believed in miracle, but still trusted in miracles of steel. Soon, entire brigades of T-34s began to run differently, their engines firing smoother, their range increasing, their acceleration sharper on frozen ground. Officers dismissed it at first as superstition, but when those same tanks began to outrun their German counterparts across the open steppe, disbelief turned to curiosity, and curiosity to quiet awe. The change was small, almost invisible in reports and communiques, yet the effect rippled across the front like a hidden tide. German Panzer divisions that had once dictated the rhythm of battle found themselves outmaneuvered by Soviet armor that no longer stalled or overheated. A difference of mere seconds in acceleration meant life or death in ambushes and withdrawals. By the time the engineers in Moscow realized what had happened, the elbow method was already folklore, an unrecorded adjustment that had spread from the mechanics' pits to the battlefields without a single order. The frontline soldiers never met Misha, but they felt his work every time a T-34 roared to life on the first try, every time its engine kept running through the night without freezing solid. Some swore the tanks themselves had changed character, as if they'd grown restless, impatient to hunt. Behind the front, Misha kept working, covered in soot and frostbite scars, never asking for recognition. To him, it wasn't invention or genius, it was survival. His trick was nothing more than necessity turned into instinct, the kind of thing a man does when there's no other choice but to make broken things move again. No newspaper ever printed his name, No medal was struck for a mechanic who used his elbow to change the course of battle, but the soldiers who lived because of that adjustment remembered. And years later, when historians argued about how the tide turned in the East, whether it was numbers, strategy, or weather, none of them could see the truth buried in the mud of that depot, that sometimes wars are won not by generals but by men who refuse to let steel die quietly. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? The change began quietly, like a rumor whispered through exhaust smoke and snow. No official command, no engineering directive from Moscow, only the murmurs of men who had seen their tanks do the impossible. In the frozen outposts of Ural, Belgorod, and the southern steppes near Kharkov, crews began speaking of a strange adjustment performed by field mechanics, a way to make the T-34 run like the wind. At first, it sounded like soldiers' superstition, one of those tales that traveled faster than supplies, but the results were undeniable. Engines that once coughed to life reluctantly at dawn now started with a growl that carried across the plains. Tanks that had struggled through mud and frost suddenly advanced with a fluid confidence that shocked even their commanders. Mechanics who'd been dismissed as lowly laborers became the keepers of a secret. They didn't call it an invention, they called it survival. Some said the trick had come from a man named Misha, with the strength of a bear's arm. Others said it came from a factory in Stalingrad, or a sergeant who'd prayed to his dead brother for guidance. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was that it worked. And in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, anything that worked became holy. By the spring thaw of 1943, the elbow method had spread through dozens of brigades, carried by men who didn't even know the inventor's name. To the Germans, the change was invisible, impossible to trace. All they saw was that the Soviets were moving differently, faster, more aggressively, their tanks appearing where they shouldn't, striking from directions thought impassable. Commanders in Berlin blamed logistics errors or overextended, but among the Wehrmacht crews, whispers began. They spoke of Russian tanks that didn't freeze, didn't falter, that seemed to be everywhere at once. Some swore they'd been modified with Western engines or secret Allied fuel. They were wrong. The only difference was a man's elbow and a few degrees of steel tolerance. But in war, such margins divide history from extinction. Behind the front lines, in workshops built from scavenged wood and frozen dirt, the mechanics worked through nights of black smoke and gunfire. They had no manuals, no spare parts, no time, only their hands, their instincts, and the will not to watch another machine die. Each adjustment carried the same ritual, the removing of panels, the sound of metal against bone, the hiss of breath as the elbow found its place beneath the injector, the faint click of correction, and the engine's answering growl, a sound that meant another day alive. They didn't speak much while they worked. Words wasted heat. Only the noise of the engines mattered. The Soviet High Command eventually took notice. Reports began to arrive from field officers noting increased mobility and reduced fuel consumption in specific regiments. Some bureaucrats tried to claim credit, calling it an experimental improvement ordered from Central Command. But the frontline men knew better. They'd seen where it began. In the hands of ordinary mechanics, with blackened elbows and eyes that never blinked when the tanks roared to life. When a colonel visited one of the depots to observe the process, he was stunned. "There's no instrument," he said. "How do you measure the adjustment?" One of the mechanics looked up from his work and answered, "We don't measure it, we feel it." That answer became a kind of creed among the repair crew. Feel it. Trust the vibration. Trust the sound. In a war ruled by orders and maps, it was the most human act of rebellion, trusting instinct over instruction, and yet it saved lives. The front stabilized. Convoys reached their objectives sooner. Fewer tanks were abandoned in the mud. Men who once feared being stranded miles from their lines began to believe again in their machines. It wasn't victory yet, but it was movement. And in that war, movement was everything. Meanwhile, far from the front, in the safety of research institutes and government offices, engineers argued about new designs, more armor, more power, more complexity. They never knew that on the frozen ground, mechanics had already found a simpler truth, that sometimes progress doesn't come from adding, but from understanding what already exists. Misha Voronin continued to work in silence, refusing transfer, refusing promotion. He didn't want to design, he wanted to fix. Those who met him said he spoke less as the war went on, that his eyes seemed always somewhere far away, watching engines turn even when he slept. By the time the Soviets prepared their counteroffensive at Kursk, the T-34 had become not just a weapon, but a living thing, responsive, wild, unpredictable, and fast. The men who drove them trusted their machines like brothers. They named them, painted them, whispered to them before battle. Each tank carried the invisible fingerprint of Misha's trick, a signature written not in ink or fame, but in the rhythm of an engine that refused to stop. And when the Germans charged in their panzers across the wheat fields of Prokhorovka, they met an army of machines that seemed to move with instinct, twisting, climbing, rushing forward in bursts that defied expectation. Many historians later called it strategy, planning, or sheer numbers, but those who were there knew better. It was the sound of engines tuned by human hands, engines that carried the heartbeat of a man who had once refused to let the cold win. When the sun rose after the battle, the air reeked of oil and smoke. Hundreds of tanks burned, both Soviet and German, blackened silhouettes against the endless plain. And somewhere in the chaos, amid the broken steel and the snow, a single truth echoed louder than the cannon. Wars are not won by those with the best machines, but by those who understand them best. If you believe stories like this, stories of ordinary hands shaping history, make sure to subscribe. There's more to uncover, more untold corners of war where genius lived in silence. The battlefield was alive before dawn. The air trembled with the sound of engines, thousands of them, breathing in rhythm beneath the morning fog. To the west, the horizon glowed red, not from sunrise, but from burning villages and the endless artillery that painted the sky in molten streaks. The Battle of Kursk was about to begin, and on that flat, open plain, everything depended on speed. German reconnaissance had already spotted the Soviet lines, and their panzer divisions, Tigers, Panthers, and Mark IVs, were massing like a black tide of precision and firepower. The Soviet T-34s waited in silence, camouflaged in the wheat fields, each one crouched like a predator before the leap. Inside those machines sat men who had been trained for one thing, to hold the line until death. But on this morning, something was different. The engines beneath them hummed smoother, colder, sharper. The vibration through the steel floor was not the uneven thrum of struggling diesels, it was a pulse. The elbow trick had reached them all. When the German assault began, it came with the force of a storm. The first shells tore through the air, splitting open the fields and flinging dirt high into the wind. Panzer formations advanced with mechanical perfection, guns trained, armor gleaming under the haze. For months, they had dominated every engagement with superior optics, range, and coordination. But as their tanks rolled forward that day, something strange met them. Silence. The Soviets didn't fire. They didn't retreat. They waited. Only the faint murmur of their engines betrayed their position, low and steady beneath the chaos. And then, as the first German wave crossed the line of smoke, the ground erupted. The T-34s surged forward, not lumbering as they once did, but gliding, fast, unpredictable, alive. To the German crews, it was like watching the earth itself move. They had studied Soviet tactics, expected clumsy charges, overheating engines, mechanical failures. What they saw instead were ghosts of steel darting between explosions, appearing and vanishing in plumes of dust. The adjusted injectors had transformed the tank's acceleration. They could now lunge forward, twist, and reposition in seconds. In the close quarters of Kursk, that difference was deadly. Panzer shells struck, but the Soviets kept coming. A formation of T-34s burst from behind a ridge, their treads flinging frozen soil into one of them, its turret painted with the crude white star of a tank commander named Andrei Fomin, cut across a burning trench and flanked two German tanks before they could turn their guns. The T-34's cannon roared once, twice, and both panzers went silent, their steel frames folding inward under the heat. Fomin's crew didn't celebrate. They didn't even speak. They turned, accelerated again, and disappeared into smoke, faster than any Soviet tank had a right to move. Across the front, similar stories played out. Soviet crews used their newfound agility to circle the Germans, closing the distance before the longer-range cannons could be brought to bear. The panzers, forced to rotate and aim under pressure, lost the advantage of precision. The battle became chaos, no longer mechanical but primal. Engines screamed, shells tore through the haze, and the earth shook with the rhythm of impact and fire. Inside each tank, the noise was unbearable, a metallic thunder that beat against bone. Communication lines failed, smoke seeped into every crack, and the world narrowed to what a man could see through a slit of reinforced glass. At a command post near Ponary, German officers watched in disbelief as their meticulously planned offensive began to unravel. Reports came in of Soviet tanks moving at speeds that defied known capabilities. "Impossible," one colonel muttered, staring at a map covered in red markers that shifted faster than they could be tracked. Another officer, a veteran of France and North Africa, whispered, "They've learned to run." And he was right. The Soviet armor, long dismissed as crude and expendable, now flowed like water around the German advance. Entire platoons of panzers found themselves isolated, surrounded, and cut off not by numbers alone, but by speed. Meanwhile, behind the chaos, the mechanics who had performed the adjustments, men like Misha Voronin, listened to the distant rumble of engines and knew what it meant. They had no radios, no way to see the battle, but they could read the sound. A steady rhythm meant victory. A faltering stutter meant death. Misha stood beside a half-broken T-34, his arm wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, his breath misting in the cold air. When the low growl reached his ears, the unmistakable harmony of synchronized diesel firing perfectly under stress, he closed his eyes and smiled. The sound was right. The steel was alive. By midday, the battlefield had become a storm of motion. Soviet tanks weaved between wrecks, taking impossible angles, cutting through artillery zones before the Germans could react. Infantry followed in their wake, charging into positions that had been untouchable hours before. Every maneuver, every burst of speed, every evasive twist was made possible by that unseen change deep in the engine, a human pulse within the machine. Crews who once cursed their tanks for stalling now trusted them with their lives. They pushed harder, drove faster, fought longer. Some tanks ran until their treads burned out, engines glowing red hot, but still refusing to stop. When the sun finally broke through the smoke, it revealed a landscape of ruin. The wheat fields were gone, replaced by a plain of craters and twisted metal. German armor lay shattered across the horizon, their formations shattered by the relentless momentum of an enemy that should never have been so fast. The Soviets paid dearly. Hundreds of tanks burned, but the front held. More than that, it moved. For the first time in years, the Red Army wasn't retreating. They were advancing. In Berlin, analysts would later argue about how the Soviets achieved such mobility. They blamed miscalculations, weather, poor communication. None of them ever heard the name Mikhail Voronin. None of them knew that in a frozen depot months before, a man had jammed his elbow into an injector and felt history shift. But every mechanic who survived knew. They passed the story along like a prayer, a quiet legend told over vodka and firelight. We didn't win because of orders. We won because one man refused to let the engines sleep. The war was far from over, but Kursk marked something irreversible. The Panzers had met their match, not in superior firepower, but in will. The elbow method would never be written in manuals or credited in reports, yet its echo lived in every battlefield after that, in every engine that started when it shouldn't have, in every tank that reached the fight before it was too late. The Eastern Front, once ruled by precision, had become a war of instinct, and instinct belonged to those who knew how to feel the machine breathe. The smoke over Kursk thickened until the sky itself seemed to burn. By the third day, the front had collapsed into chaos, no longer a clean line of offense and defense, but a labyrinth of craters, wrecks, and corpses. The air stank of oil and cordite. The sound never stopped. The constant coughing thunder of engines, the tearing rhythm of machine guns, the hollow screams carried by the wind. Men moved through that nightmare like ghosts, covered in soot and mud, indistinguishable from the landscape they fought for. The T-34s still roared, their tracks cutting deep grooves into the earth, their new pulse of speed giving them the only advantage left, momentum. On the western ridge near Prokhorovka, a company of Soviet tanks lay in wait beneath the cover of smoke. Their commander, Major Andrei Fomin, stared through the periscope slit of his tank, his eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of flame in the distance. He had fought since '41, since the first German boots touched Soviet soil, and he had buried half his men in snow, mud, and ash. Now he waited, motionless, for the Panzers to crest the ridge. His driver tapped the ignition again. The engine hummed like a living thing, steady and low. Fomin could feel it through the soles of his boots, that rhythm he'd learned to trust, that new life the mechanics had given them. "She breathes like she wants to fight," the driver muttered. Fomin didn't answer. He only nodded. Across the field, the German advance was already in motion. Dozens of panzers rolled in tight formation, their engines growling in mechanical harmony, every movement calculated and synchronized. Their commander, Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss, had spent his career believing in the perfection of German engineering. The Panzer was his religion, elegant, efficient, disciplined. He had studied the enemy for years, memorized their flaws, their crude optics, their unreliable engines, their slow responses in cold weather. But that morning, as he looked through his binoculars, something unsettled. The Soviet tanks ahead weren't static. They were shifting. Subtle movements, barely visible, but too quick, too precise. "Sie sind schneller," his gunner whispered. "They're faster." Weiss dismissed it at first, blamed the fog, the adrenaline. But when the first exchange of fire erupted, he understood. The T-34s didn't wait for range. They surged forward like beasts released from a cage, accelerating with impossible aggression. The German gunners barely had time to adjust before the first shot struck. Armor-piercing shells tore through the air, slamming into the Panzer line with explosive force. One tank vanished in a column of fire. Weiss barked orders, trying to maintain formation, but the battlefield no longer obeyed formations. Soviet tanks darted across the field in wide, sweeping arcs, flanking the Germans faster than any intelligence report had warned. The elbow method had given the T-34s their edge. They could shift gears smoother, pivot faster, recover from stalls in seconds. Against the precise but slower Panzers, that agility was chaos incarnate. Fomin's tank burst through the smoke, its gun recoiling as a shell slammed into a Tiger's turret. The explosion tore the machine open like a tin can, flames spilling into the wheat field. "Left flank! Keep moving!" Fomin shouted, gripping the steel handles above his head as the tank jolted forward. Inside, the heat was unbearable. The loader's hands bled from the metal casings, but he didn't stop. They fired again, and another Panzer vanished behind black smoke. Around them, the field was a furnace. Dozens of machines dueling at close range, cannons roaring point blank, tracks grinding against broken armor. Men died unseen, swallowed by the noise and the fire. Weiss tried to rally his crews. "Hold position. Use the optics. They're coming too close," but his words drowned under the chaos. A T-34 appeared through the smoke barely 30 meters ahead, a blur of motion, its engine screaming at full throttle. Weiss turned the turret manually, but the Soviet shot came first. The shell hit just below the viewport, shattering glass and sending shards into his face. Blood filled his eyes as the Panzer erupted around him. He stumbled out into the open air, flames licking at his uniform, his hearing gone. All he could see were dark silhouettes of enemy tanks circling like wolves, their engines snarling through the fire. For the first time in his career, Weiss understood what it meant to be hunted. By noon, the battlefield had dissolved into fragments of resistance. Small German units fought desperately to retreat, while the Soviet tanks pressed on with relentless speed. The ground trembled beneath the weight of advancing armor. Mechanics at the rear listened to the distant growl and recognized it instantly. That new sound, the low, even rhythm of engines that no longer faltered. Misha Voronin stood among them, his arms streaked with oil and frostbite scars. He didn't smile or celebrate. He only stared toward the horizon, where columns of black smoke rose into the sky like the ghosts of every broken tank he had ever repaired. "They're still running," he whispered. As night fell, the battlefield went silent except for the crackling of fire and the faint sputter of damaged engines still trying to live. The wheat fields were gone. The earth turned to ash. Soviet soldiers walked among the wrecks, searching for survivors, pulling bodies from metal coffins. Some tanks still glowed from the heat of their engines, T-34s that had pushed too far, too hard, refusing to stop until the fight was over. One mechanic, kneeling beside a still-burning tank, said quietly, "It's like they didn't want to die." And maybe that was true. Maybe those machines carried the stubbornness of the men who had built and bled for them, who had willed them into motion when everything else had failed. In Berlin, the reports called Kursk a strategic setback. In Moscow, they called it the beginning of victory. But for the men who fought there, it was something else entirely. The moment when steel learned defiance. The T-34 had always been a weapon of endurance, but now it had become a weapon of instinct, a reflection of the men who repaired it with their hands, who tuned it not by rule, but by feel. Every victory after Kursk carried the echo of that transformation, a quiet testament to the invisible mechanic who had given motion to desperation. War historians would later measure the turning points by numbers: divisions destroyed, kilometers gained, supply lines cut. But the truth lived in the details too small for charts. The twist of a bolt, the grind of an elbow against steel, the breath of an engine that refused to freeze. The difference between defeat and momentum had been the touch of one man who felt the heartbeat of machines when others only heard noise. The Eastern Front never slowed after that. The Red Army began to push west, the Germans began to retreat, and history turned on a sound, the hum of a diesel that ran smoother than it ever should have. And in that hum lived a message about all wars, about all men, that sometimes survival begins with stubbornness and victory with a touch of understanding. Tell me something. If you had been there, if you had watched your world collapsing under fire and found one small way to change it, would you have done it? Comment below and write this phrase so I know you felt it too. One man can make the machine breathe. When the smoke of Kursk finally cleared, the silence felt heavier than the battle itself. The wind carried the stench of burned fuel and the faint hiss of engines dying one by one, the last gasps of machines that had done more than they were ever built to do. The field was no longer a battlefield, it was a cemetery of steel. Soviet soldiers moved between twisted hulls, their boots sinking into the mud soaked with oil and blood. They didn't speak, they didn't cheer. Victory didn't sound like music or flags waving. It sounded like the creak of cooling metal, the quiet sobs of men who had lived through another day that should have ended them. Among them, the T-34s stood blackened but unbroken, their armor pitted, their tracks half buried, but their engines still warm. That warmth meant life. It meant movement. In the makeshift workshops behind the lines, the mechanics worked without pause. Their hands were raw, fingers cracked and bleeding, but they didn't stop. They dragged in damaged tanks, patched holes, replaced bearings, adjusted injectors by touch in the dark. Every repaired tank was a promise to the men who would take it next, a promise that it would move when they needed it most. Mikhail Voronin sat among them, silent as ever, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the bones of his arms bruised from endless labor. He never claimed the miracle for himself. He never called it genius. To him, it was just what had to be done. But word had spread through the ranks. Officers came to see the man who could make machines come alive again, who could make them run when the cold and the chaos said they shouldn't. Misha never lifted his head to greet them. He simply pointed to the next engine, muttered something about fuel flow, and went back to work. Outside, new recruits watched the older mechanics work, memorizing the ritual, the precise pressure of the arm, the way the elbow angled into the metal, the faint pause before the engine came to life. It was no longer superstition, it was scripture. The elbow trick had become part of the Red Army's unofficial code, passed from man to man like a whispered prayer. It wasn't written in manuals or stamped on blueprints, but every soldier knew someone who'd seen it. Every crew had a tank that ran smoother because of it. In the dark humor of war, they began to say the tanks had souls, that they only obeyed the hands of those who respected. Weeks passed, and the front pushed west. Each kilometer gained cost dozens of machines, hundreds of men, yet the morale was different now. The fear of mechanical failure, the dread of dying in a tank that refused to move, had been replaced by trust. The crews believed in their machines again, and belief is a weapon. The Germans felt it too. Reports began noting increased Soviet mobility, faster redeployments, unpredictable flanking attacks. To Berlin, it seemed like a logistical mystery. To Moscow, it was a blessing. To the men who knew, it was Misha's will made real. In the ruins of a village near Belgorod, Misha and his team recovered a half-burned T-34. The turret was jammed, the treads twisted, the interior coated in ash. Inside, they found the driver's body, hands still on the levers, frozen where he had died. Misha didn't look away. He climbed inside, cleared the man's grip, and sat in the same seat. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he pressed his elbow beneath the cracked injector pump and turned it slightly. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared. The men outside froze, watching the blackened tank come to life. The noise was deafening, raw, and uneven, but alive. Misha climbed out, eyes red from the smoke, and said quietly, "If it breathes, it fights." No one answered him. They didn't need to. They all understood. That night, under a sky split by artillery flashes, the mechanics sat around a fire built from broken crates and scraps of rubber. No one spoke of glory. They spoke of engines, of sounds, of vibrations, the language of survival. One man asked Misha how he had thought of the adjustment in the first place. He shrugged. "I didn't think. I listened." The others nodded. That was all there was to it. In a world of explosions and orders, he had chosen to listen to something quieter, the truth hidden inside the machine. As the Red Army advanced, the factories in the east began hearing of this method too. Workers returning from the front told stories of the miracle mechanic. Engineers in Moscow dismissed it as folklore, until they tested a tank adjusted by one of Misha's men. The readings shocked them. Better fuel efficiency, smoother torque, faster throttle response. They couldn't explain it with theory, only with feel. For the first time, official directives were sent encouraging field adaptation of injector alignment. No one credited Mikhail Voronin by name, but among the mechanics, that didn't matter. They knew who had given them the idea. In the quiet between offensives, when the guns went still for a few hours and only the cold wind whispered across the plains, Misha would sit by the tank, his back against their armor, eyes fixed on nothing. He talked to them sometimes, just low murmurs lost to the night. The other men pretended not to hear. Maybe he wasn't talking to the machines, but to the souls trapped inside them, the drivers, the gunners, the boys who had burned alive in their steel coffin. Maybe he was asking their forgiveness. Maybe he was thanking them for teaching him how to make the next one live longer. War is strange that it teaches men to love the things that kill them, to find beauty in the roar of engines that drag them closer to death. For Misha, that sound had become his heartbeat. He no longer remembered what silence felt like. The war would end one day. He knew that, but he also knew he would never be able to stop hearing the machines breathe. That was the curse of those who fixed things in hell. They carried the noise home with them, and yet in that noise lived something sacred. Because every tank that started when it shouldn't have, every engine that roared back to life in the cold, every soldier who made it home because of that, they all carried a fragment of Misha's stubbornness. A man who refused to let steel die quietly had given motion to an entire army. He had shifted the balance not with orders or invention, but with understanding. And that, in the end, was the greatest act of defiance of all. By the winter of 1944, the roar of Soviet engines had become the pulse of the continent. What had once been a desperate defense was now a relentless advance. The Red Army moved like a living organism, tanks, trucks, and infantry flowing together with brutal precision. But in the cold workshops behind the lines, far from the banners and speeches, the war still felt the same, cold, dirty, endless. Mikhail Voronin remained there, his face older now, carved by exhaustion and smoke. His elbow ached constantly, swollen and scarred, yet he refused to rest. He said it throbbed when the engines misfired, as though his own bones had become part of the machines he'd fixed. The younger mechanics joked about it, calling him the elbow of the motherland, but when something went wrong, they always came to him first. The factories were running faster now. The T-34 had evolved, its armor thicker, its cannon longer, its engine slightly more refined. Yet the essence of Misha's trick lived inside every one of them. Even the factory foreman knew the adjustment by heart, teaching it to apprentices as if it were part of assembly protocol. In secret corners of the production halls, old mechanics whispered stories of the man who had taught the machines to breathe differently. No one could explain it on paper, but every veteran engineer recognized the difference in sound. The smoother start, the clean hum that came from engines tuned not by instruments, but by instinct. The elbow trick had transcended its creator. It had become the soul of Soviet steel. At the front, soldiers could feel the change in more than their machine. There was a rhythm to the movement now, a strange confidence. The same tank that had once been sluggish in the mud now climbed hills and crossed rivers with unnatural ease. They began calling them Voronin's children. The name spread unofficially, half myth, half memory. Crews painted small elbows on the sides of their turrets in chalk before battle, a symbol of luck, of movement, of the quiet defiance that had turned the tide. When the tanks moved westward, cutting through the ruins of Poland and Belarus, the sound of their engines seemed to carry stories with them of the depots, the sweat, the frost, the mechanic who had refused to let a machine die. Misha himself never went west. He stayed in the rear, overseeing repair columns that stretched for miles. He worked silently, never writing letters, never asking about the front. Sometimes couriers brought him news, rumors of victory, the liberation of cities, the fall of German lines. He would nod, light another cigarette, and return to the noise of wrenches and engines. The war outside meant nothing to him compared to the one he fought daily against time, fatigue, and rust. To the men who worked beside him, he had become something almost unreal, a figure of endurance. They said he could listen to an engine for 5 seconds and tell its story, how long it had fought, where it had been hit, how many men it had carried to their deaths. One night, as snow fell in thick silence, a messenger arrived at the workshop. He carried orders from Moscow, commendations, medals, new assignments. Misha didn't open them. He tossed the envelope onto the workbench and kept cleaning a fuel pump. The others watched him quietly. After a while, one of the younger men asked, "Why won't you look? They say it's high honors." Misha didn't look up. "Engines don't care about medals," he said, "and neither do I." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. They understood. For him, the war wasn't about recognition. It was about motion. As long as there were tanks that could still move, his job wasn't done. By early spring, the Red Army had reached the Vistula. The Germans were in retreat, their once mighty divisions shattered. The balance of the Eastern Front had shifted completely. Yet, for all the strategic brilliance attributed to generals, to logistics, to industrial capacity, there was another, quieter truth buried beneath it all: the thousands of tiny acts of ingenuity that kept the war machine alive. Every mechanic who had once been taught to use his elbow instead of a wrench carried a fragment of that truth. It was humanity, disguised as labor, survival hidden in grease and noise. When one of them died, the others felt it not through grief, but through silence, the silence of an engine that wouldn't start. Sometimes, Misha would walk out at night to the edge of the depot, where abandoned tanks rested like sleeping giants under the snow. He would place his hand on their armor, listening. The metal was cold, but he swore he could feel a faint tremor, a whisper of life deep inside. "They remember," he said once, his breath forming clouds in the air. "They remember how we saved them." The younger mechanic beside him laughed, thinking it was a joke. Misha didn't laugh. He simply walked back toward the lights, leaving a trail of footprints in the frost. When the war finally began to tilt decisively toward victory, Moscow sent photographers and journalists to document the heroes of the Soviet industry. They wanted faces, men to symbolize resilience. Someone mentioned Mikhail Voronin's name. They found him in the depot, elbow deep in a gearbox, his uniform torn and black with oil. The photographer asked him to stand beside a tank, to smile for the record. Misha refused. "You want to take a picture of me?" he said. "Then take one of the machine. It's the one that lived." The reporter insisted, but Misha turned away. The photo that ran later showed a single T-34 idling in the snow, steam rising from its exhaust, a faint shadow of a man in the background. No caption named him. None needed to. That spring, when the thaw came, the depot filled with mud again, the same mud that had buried so many engines before. Yet this time, the tanks didn't die in it. They rolled forward, one after another, through the sludge, across rivers, through villages reduced to rubble. Every turn of their tracks was an act of remembrance. The soldiers inside them never met the man who had given their machines breath, but they felt him in every vibration, every heartbeat of the engine under their feet. And though Misha would never see Berlin, his touch reached it all the same, carried inside the engines that refused to stop. War had made him a ghost long before peace arrived, but ghosts have power when they refuse to rest. His name would fade, his story would sink beneath layers of official reports and industrial statistics, but the echo of his work remained, unseen, uncredited, unstoppable. A mechanic's elbow had turned the world a few degrees, and history had followed. When the war finally ended, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. Across the scarred land that stretched from Stalingrad to Berlin, the tanks stood silent, their engines cold, their tracks buried in dust and weeds. The smoke had cleared, but the air still carried the taste of oil and iron, as if the war itself refused to fade. In the cities, people celebrated, waving flags, singing through their hunger and grief. But in the quiet outskirts, where the workshops once trembled with noise, there was only stillness. The mechanics who had kept the front alive packed their tools, one by one, and went home to places that no longer existed. Among them was Mikhail Voronin, his elbow bound in cloth, his hair turned white before its time. He left the depot the same way he had entered it years earlier, without ceremony, without goodbye. He returned to a small village east of Kursk, a place that had once been his home. There was nothing left but stones and the crooked skeleton of a barn. His wife had died during the evacuation, his brother at the front, his parents long gone. The only thing that remained standing was the memory of engines in his head, the rhythm of motion that refused to leave him. He found work in a tractor factory rebuilt from wartime ruins, where old tank parts were melted down and reborn as tools for the harvest. The men there recognized him from the stories that had traveled through the ranks, though no one dared to say his name aloud. They just called him the mechanic, as if that alone carried the weight of everything he had done. The tractors were crude, noisy, stubborn things, machines that groaned under the weight of every plow, but Misha treated them like he had treated the tanks, with reverence, with patience, with the same silent fury against failure. Sometimes, when one refused to start, the younger workers would watch him roll up his sleeve, press his arm into the engine housing, and twist his elbow just so. The machine would cough, sputter, and roar to life, and the men would laugh and call it magic. Misha would shake his head and say, "Not magic, just listening." He never told them what he had really done in the war. He never said the words elbow trick again. The world had no place for war legends anymore, only for quiet hands that kept the machines of peace moving. Years passed. The Soviet Union rebuilt. New tanks replaced the old T-34s. The factories grew vast and impersonal, their machines operated by younger men who had never seen war. Yet sometimes, when a veteran mechanic walked past an engine that purred too perfectly, he would stop and smile. There was something familiar in the sound, a balance too natural to have come from blueprints alone. Some said the spirit of those old machines lived on, that the steel remembered the touch of men who had tuned them by feel and by faith. In distant museums decades later, historians would study the T-34 and call it an engineering marvel. They would measure its angles, analyze its armor, dissect its engine design. None of them would write about the man who had felt its heartbeat through his bones. In the summer of 1955, long after peace had settled like dust, Mikhail Voronin sat outside his workshop at dusk, watching the light fade across the field. The air was heavy with the hum of tractors returning from work, their engines deep and calm. He closed his eyes and listened. It was the same sound he had heard in the war, only softer now, more human. A young boy, his apprentice, came running from the shed, shouting that one of the machines wouldn't start. Misha smiled faintly, rose with effort, and followed him. The boy watched as he crouched beside the tractor, his hands trembling slightly from age. He pressed his arm into the engine's heart, just as he had done countless times before, and turned until he felt the click. The engine answered him with a low, steady hum. The boy clapped his hands, laughing. "How did you do that?" Misha looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You don't fix machines, you understand them." That night, he sat by his window, the faint echo of engines rolling through the distance like a lullaby. He thought of the men who had fought beside those machines, of the ones who never returned, of the way war had given him purpose and stolen everything else. He wondered if the tanks he had saved still rested somewhere in the forests of Europe, their metal rusting, their engines forever silent. He hoped someone, someday, would hear their story, not through medals or speeches, but through the sound of a machine that refused to die. When he passed away that winter, there was no ceremony, no record in the papers. His tools were left on his bench, still stained with oil. But among the mechanics who had learned from him, word spread quietly, "The elbow is gone." In the years that followed, when an engine started against all odds, when a machine ran smoother than it should have, someone would always whisper his name, not in reverence, but in gratitude, because long after generals and heroes had been forgotten, the world still moved to the rhythm he had taught it, to the hum of motion born from patience and touch. And somewhere in the memory of history, beyond the noise of battles and the pride of nations, a simple truth remains. Sometimes, the smallest movement of one man's arm can shift the course of the entire world. If this story reached you, if you felt that spark of quiet strength that keeps things moving, even when everything seems broken, like this video, share it and subscribe, because stories like Mikhail's deserve to keep running, just like the engines he refused to let die.